the hypocrisy, I think, in all these gangsters, that's something that a lot of people recognize, but that's not something, at least to me, that's going to make me, maybe I should reflect on my own life and actions because, it's just too far removed from my own reality, my non-gangster reality to really make that connection. But by flipping that around to Richie, who's more of this everyday guy who's just doing well on the job but not doing well at home, that's something I can more easier relate to. Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by my fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to welcome you back to our Gangster Cinema series, in which we cover the evolution of gangster movies throughout the decades. Last week we discussed Scorsese's Goodfellas and the gangster cinema of the 90s, and today we're moving into the new millennium with Ridley Scott's American Gangster. If you want to follow along with us, see what other gangster movies are coming up and discuss them with us and other listeners, be sure to join us on our Discord server. You can find the link for that down in the description. Okay, so new millennium, new time for the gangster movie. I think this was, for me at least, was the hardest decennia to pick like one iconic gangster movies. I've seen a couple of them, plenty of them even, but it really felt like to me that the sort of democratization that we saw with Goodfellas, the more focus on not the mob boss sitting at the top of the mountain, but more of like the middle guy and the smaller guys. It's really a trend that continued throughout the zeros or the 2000s.
Yeah.
And it led to a lot of interesting smaller movies, I think. Some notable ones that I've seen are City of God, really good, from Brazil. Eastern Promises, which focuses more on Russian gangsters, even though it's an American or English produced movie. A Prophet, which is a really good French movie about, I think it was an Algerian man who is sent to prison, and there he gets caught up in like the gangster life, and it's kind of that story where someone is sent to prison only to become something worse. There's Layer Cake, which I thought was really interesting. It's kind of it's a movie directed by Matthew Vaughn, but it has this really early David Fincher / Danny Boyle feel to it, and it's also one that really shows that the gangster movie at this point, or at least for this character, is just all about the business. It's not about becoming part of some family or rising to the top. It's just, getting the quick buck and then getting out, which, as the movie shows or critiques, is easier said than done. Scorsese continues to make great movies. The Departed came out in the zeros, really good. Also an interesting connection there with the movie that we're actually talking about, American Gangster, is that there's now a bigger focus also, I think, on the law enforcement side.
Yes.
The Department is this kind of, or the Departed is this kind of cat and mouse game between two rats, essentially. There's an undercover gangster at the police department and a police officer undercover with the gangsters, and it's one of my favorites actually of Scorsese, even though we don't talk about it that often, I feel. And then lastly, the one that I actually rewatched also this morning is Snatch, which is this really iconic British Guy Ritchie movie, which also set its own sort of trend, I think, or its own stylistically, at least it set its own, it carved out its own little territory in the gangster cinema subgenre that a lot of movies that came later tried to imitate or try to build on. So yeah, that's basically where I came in at in the zeros with the gangster movies. We decided on American Gangster because I feel like that's when you look at the movies we've been talking about, I feel like this is the best cinematic continuation of that. Last week we also talked about The Sopranos, but that's television, which is a little bit out of our the realm of our discussion here. But yeah, I think as far as movies go, that American Gangster really is this an interesting sort of stepping stone in the line that we've sort of been drawing from The Godfather in the 70s up until the present day, which, in the sense that it's this really sort of sweeping crime saga, just as Scarface, just as Goodfellas, just as The Godfather. But it also does a few things different, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But I also wanted to ask you, what's your general connection with gangster movies from the zeros? What's your first impression on moving from the 90s into this new decade?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you kind of describe how there's all these different movies that focus on smaller aspects of kind of crime within the gangster world or, adjacent to it. And I think that's an evolution in kind of the type of stories that are being told in the 2000s, but also it sort of reflects probably to some extent something that we see a little bit in this movie that we're talking about today, kind of the shift away from these more monolithic mob families as kind of the gangster culture is kind of fragmenting and disintegrating a little bit or reduced in power. That's something that's depicted again in the Sopranos, which isn't really part of our discussion, but I think is at least worth mentioning here, because especially once we get into the 2000s, depictions for me in this era, I haven't seen as many of the movies that you're talking about, but to me the most the biggest, most culturally impactful depictions of gang crime in the 2000s were two television shows, The Sopranos and also I think The Wire, which kind of feels like The Wire started in 2002.
Did Breaking Bad start in the zeros, or was that after 2010?
Breaking Bad came after The Sopranos and The Wire. I feel like that movie very much follows kind of like in their footsteps.
2008.
2008, yeah.
So, yeah.
So that started right on the heel of this. So there's this gangster lineage kind of maybe gets taken over. The traditional one that we saw in the movies gets kind of taken over by television. And so I think the movies, to a certain degree, start exploring different territory. Maybe not because of TV. Maybe that's just the way things are going. But there's definitely a palpable change, I think. But one of the big relationships, I don't know that The Wire influenced this movie directly, because this was being written right around the time season 1 of The Wire was coming out. But the show The Wire, I think, was ending right when American Gangster came out. But there's a lot of overlap here between like the way it's depicting both sides kind of against each other, which is something you also mentioned. It comes up in The Departed. There seems like a much more conscious like examination of the police, not just in their process of taking down the gangsters, but also kind of ways in which the police might be operating at like in gang-like ways.
Yeah,
something I think we see depicted here and in The Wire. That's something that's definitely, we've talked about how that's definitely alluded to in all the movies we've talked about so far, but the police, the corrupt police, never really become central characters in the story, which is kind of what we see here, but also we're seeing, the one lone rogue, good cop in the midst of all the corrupt guys that's taking them down. But yeah, I definitely think this one fits best in sort of this trajectory that we're exploring, while still, evolving on that a little bit.
Yeah. Let's briefly talk about the elements that it carries over from the previous movies that we've talked about before going into the differences and seeing what the American Gangster adds to the genre or to the discussion that we've been having so far. Did you have any general thoughts on that?
The first biggest, most obvious thing is you have this classic rise and fall that we've talked about, where we're following one gangster's rise to power and then kind of the eventual tragedy of that.
Yeah.
The big difference here is you have a black gangster in Harlem, and so there's a deviation. I mean, we kind of saw that already with Scarface, where we had, an immigrant gangster, but there's a strong deviation from the kind of classic Italian mafia story that we've been seeing. And that's kind of a point that this movie kind of harps on to a certain degree. And it's definitely part of sort of like the cultural landscape at the time. Yeah, so that's the biggest difference. There's that classic structure that we've seen, but then the first twist is it's Denzel Washington, and the second twist is the addition of the police character.
I'd also say, like, as for what it does that the other movies also did, is that it covers this wide
span of time.
Wide span of time. Like Goodfellas, it also covers a true to life story, a true story, which I don't think isn't not necessarily a staple of the genre, but it's just it's an interesting observation. As we started with more fictional stories or more fictionalized stories, and then slowly moved towards apparently more true to life stories.
Yes. Although my research on this one definitely brought up the fact that this might as well be a fictional story. The people, the names of the people in it are real. Frank Lucas was a real character. Richie Roberts was a real person. But apparently many of the details of how everything went down are mostly or entirely fabricated. But maybe we can get a little bit more into that later. I'm not sure how relevant it is, except I think it's interesting that we see what is a true story being really contorted, potentially to fit this story into sort of the tropes of the genre. So like the real life story itself might have been very, there's this pressure, I think, to contort the characters so that it feels like a gangster movie, because that's the kind of lineage that it's stepping into. But yeah, anyway, maybe that's getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, I read the same thing, especially also about Lucas's character, that he in real life was apparently much more violent and much more like crude and in some ways even unintelligent, I think he was described. Whereas Denzel Washington, of course, plays him with this like cool demeanor and calm, stoic intelligence, which rings more closely to like a Michael Corleone, who is someone who has a lot going on internally and who knows how to take care of the business, who knows how to behave himself within an environment and knows how to get himself on top of things. And that part definitely feels very dramatized. And I also feel like they've added certain elements to make the story more, to just add more dramatic tension and more dramatic irony, I think, also to the story. There's this clear or this stark contrast between Frank Lucas being this bad gangster who's also a great family man and who cares about his family and who, gets up at 5 a.m., he goes to church and he drives his mother around and all that sort of stuff. While on the other side doing all the bad gangster stuff. And then there's the cop character, Richie, who is the great sort of incorruptible policeman, even within his own department. But then privately, he is the sort of deadbeat dad who is in the middle of a divorce and, just doesn't seem like a very virtuous person in his private life. that I think is something that's very deliberate. That's just that screenwriting stuff. That's not.
Yeah.
I don't think that's. I think that Richie didn't even have a kid in real life or something like that.
Yeah, that's what I was reading. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's fine. I guess that's
right.
It adds an interesting, some interesting motifs, I think, to the story that also cross at a later point where, towards the end, there's a sort of you have the two characters sort of coming closer together and then crossing each other at some point, after which Richie gets to have this revelation that also in his private life really makes him act more virtuously, basically having him enact the same principles that he uses on the job to resolve his divorce in an honorable way, whereas Lucas towards the end becomes more, as you see with most of the downfalls of the gangster figures, he becomes more paranoid, more violent, more just altogether more quote-unquote bad towards those who he used to be or used to have this mask in front of, or those who he used to care about. There's an interesting dramatization there of the way the characters interact. But yeah, maybe all this is getting ahead a little bit too far of the fact that the one major addition to this story compared to others, the other gangster stories that we've talked about, is that inclusion of the police force perspective, and specifically also of this one character, Richie, who is a sort of outsider within his own police force because he is the one who is not corruptible. At least there's this event that took place before the movie happens, in which Richie and his partner had a chance to take away, I think, a million or something. They had a chance to do some corruption, but they turned the money and they did like the right thing to do. And ever since then, they've become these pariahs within the police department. They, are looked down upon by the other cops, and they're not trusted also because, if all the other cops are corrupt and then they are honest, that means that, there's no, there's obvious friction there where whenever the cops feel like they cannot trust their own, and that also causes his partner, I think, to start doing cocaine or heroin or something. He becomes this drug addict. I think he starts doing the cocaine that is eventually dealt by Frank Lucas's character, because I think that's also
what he overdoses on. Yeah.
That's also what creates this personal link that makes Richie motivated to specifically start hunting down Frank Lucas, who he doesn't know at this point is the one who's dealing all these drugs. So yeah, that I think was a very interesting addition to the other movies that we've been talking about. I feel like there was already a seed for that planted in the 80s with the Untouchables, which also had this more a cop-centric perspective on what was essentially still a gangster story. That was about Al Capone and the Prohibition, but told from the police's perspective. And now I think we're seeing something similar here, where you get to see more an inside perspective from the police force, which in the other movies has been a presence, but it's been, from the perspective of the gangsters. It's, we've seen the police officers as corrupt, and in some ways even as one of the reasons that the gangsters exist, because the police force themselves, they cannot be trusted to do their job, and they cannot be trusted to keep the community safe, and that's where these gangsters stepped in. And I think it's very interesting that that's an element that is carried over, that systemic corruption, and sort of the quote-unquote gangster-ishness of the legal side of United States institutions, which kind of as this sort of corrupted mirror of the gangster life, and then tells that story from the inside out instead of from the outside in. That's just something I thought was very interesting, and also made, for me at least, the story a lot more interesting, because I have to say I did enjoy American Gangster a lot more than I remembered I did, like the first time I saw it. I think I saw it when it came out or shortly after, and I thought like, oh, this is nice or fun movie, but I forgot like how well crafted of a story it actually is, and I'm a fan overall.
The temples for me here are pitting those two characters against each other and having these kind of warring characters is really buoyed here by excellent performances from Russell Crowe and Denzel Washington. So it's just really fun to see both of these characters kind of on their rise, doing their work, and kind of like playing this game against each other. And I think, that makes for a really different movie than what we've seen from the other ones so far, and kind of a new variation. Now, towards the end, for Denzel's character, for Frank Lucas, the paranoia isn't, am I going to get whacked? Are the other gangs coming after me? It's, is the law going to catch up to me? He has paranoia where he kind of has the other gangs taken care of. Like, there's a moment where somebody tries to make a hit on him, and I don't know that it's ever confirmed who that actually was, but it's almost even implied that that's probably the corrupt the police, the Josh Brolin character, the Detective Trudeau guy.
Yeah.
So it's like the real threat is the law enforcement rather than the other gangs or, the other gangsters.
Specifically also, I think the actual virtue that they are supposed to represent, because, the law enforcement themselves for a long time wasn't an issue because they were just paid off.
Right.
Just as the other gangs were kept happy in their own way. So I think what the movie shows here is that, Frank managed to play the gangster life perfectly, but the one thing it's incapable of or ultimately incapable of overcoming is that sort of incorruptible true virtue that, more honestly reflects the true, the sort of evil-ish nature of the gangster life and the violence and the corruption and the destruction and all that it really consists of. And so that, I think, is a really interesting subversion also there, where it's, as you said, he's not just being whacked by some other gangster who then steps up, but he's really, I think, for the first time in the gangster movies that we've discussed so far, it feels like there's something that actually changes for the better at the end. It's not just, a gangster or a gangster dies and another takes over, or, the one gets whacked but the other lives, or, the one snitches on his friends, but the system is still corrupt. But it feels like there's also a sort of, it does feel like the streets are a little bit cleaner by the end of this movie than they were at the beginning. Not to speak in too big of an absolute here, because obviously crime wasn't solved in 1970 or whenever this story ended. But it does feel like there is, I do feel like the movie makes a point of trying to depict some sort of quality that could genuinely, be a foil for the gangster life and the way these gangsters operate.
Yeah, I definitely agree that I think that's what it's getting at. I think ultimately where I get a little bit nervous, and I'll talk about the two sides of this, is that I think to some extent that's a little bit of like a myth, like a myth in the classic sense of like what's being presented here is like, oh, this heroic story of this one cop who's so uncorrupt that he can operate within the system and take this guy down. And I think that's not, in a lot of ways, like a depiction of the reality we see with how these things play out. It's not that law enforcement doesn't sometimes take these things down. And I think around this time, there's a reduction in organized crime, largely due to like the formation of these federal bureaus. It's kind of touched on in this film. The formation of the DEA happens specifically to start targeting narcotics, which is something, it's interesting that we kind of see this arc start in The Godfather where the gangsters themselves are like, don't touch the drugs because the drugs are bad news for us. Like, that's bad business to get into. And literally that is part of what ends up being their downfall, in a sense, where that is what is leveraged against them to really, create this war against drug gangs, essentially. And I think that gives federal government some of the leverage that it wants or needs in order to be able to come in and try to crack down on these things. But there's a flip side to that story, which is that while maybe some of the internal, like, organized crime related corruption is reduced, and maybe there is a reduction in some of these things, the war on drugs, at least in the United States, continues to be like a largely ineffective ongoing war that doesn't really accomplish many of its goals. So there's a sense in which this movie kind of depicts Richie as like, oh, we're forming the narcotics bureau. Here's this heroic guy that's pushing the charge on essentially what is the beginning of the DEA. And then that institution ends up not being quite as maybe successful as what is depicted, or what you might imagine based on what's depicted in this movie. I will say the caveat to that, it's not like this movie is quote unquote propaganda in that sense, because it's also depicting intense police corruption too. And part of what this guy is taking down is this huge internal network of corruption.
By the end, it's not just the gangsters who get arrested, but it's also a bunch of the corrupted officers that are being charged, and I'm not sure if they were convicted or
they weren't ultimately convicted, which is part of that's part of the the thing with stories like this is like, this kind a lot of times this corruption like this continues to perpetrate to some degree because it's really hard to get actual convictions against law enforcement in a lot of cases. But there was it was tough to figure out what this movie's relationship to the reality of things that went down happened, because there was actually an instance where the DEA sued the movie for defamation.
Really?
Because at the end of the film, one of the titles claims that it makes a specific claim about DEA officers being convicted, and the defamation lawsuit was thrown out because the attorney was like, that claim ultimately ended up not being true, but also the movie never depicted any actual DEA agents. It didn't qualify as defamation.
Yeah.
But there is a slightly distorted claim at the end of this movie that kind of overstates the amount of success that this particular case had in kind of taking down specifically like DEA corruption. Although maybe that didn't exist in the first place if they were suing, or maybe it did and they were just suing. It's hard. Who knows? I didn't do enough research to get to the bottom of it.
I feel like in that sense, when I spoke of the kind of virtues and vices that the movie displays, I think I'm seeing it more as not as a little literal piece of history, because obviously Ridley Scott has fictionalized a lot of it, but more as his sort of idealized vision of, look how much better the world could be if only, the police systems were cleaned out from corruption. We had those better oversights, and gangsters wouldn't be a thing, or
if individuals make the right choices, weren't corrupt, then that could, which I think
that's something that Ridley Scott comes back to a lot of times in his movies. Kingdom of Heaven very much focuses on personal morality. Gladiator, to some extent, is also about Russell Crowe's stoicism in that movie. I'm sure there's other movies that I can't think of at the moment, but I feel like those are the closest ones to American Gangster, both in the time, in the sense of time of release as well as thematically.
I feel like the interesting thing with that for me is on some level, like, I completely agree. I think this is a great message in the sense that, you know, your individual choice, your individual morality and the choices you make and the responsibility you have in your life, you know, if you're a police officer choosing not to be corrupt, is like essentially the scope of your individual power, or the thing that largely you as an individual can be judged by morally. But there's this flip side of the coin, which is something that kind of comes up in the movie explicitly towards the end, where there's this conversation that Frank Lucas has with Richie, where they kind of talk very frankly and openly. And there's this relationship between sort of like the right thing to do and kind of the quote unquote the facts of the reality of the situation, which is much more about this like systemic environment and the things that lead to these individuals being put in a place where they see, you know, corruption as being the choice that can be made, or they see corruption as being something they can get away with. You know, there's this systemic flip side to things. And there's a line Richie has in here somewhere that I really loved, which was like, stop bringing dope into this country and about 100,000 people are going to be out of a job. So the movie's definitely aware of, like, you know, kind of these, it's also talking about Vietnam and all the things that are going on in the country at the time, this much larger, like, systemic thing that's surrounding that, which is something that things like The Sopranos and I think The Wire are also examining. So I think that's part of the, like, this 2000 shift as well, is this sort of like having a little bit more historical context on sort of the events that were happening during this era, which is, we didn't mention, but like 70s to 80s, 80s, 90s, 60s.
Still chronologically behind Scarface, I think.
Right. Yeah. So there's a broadening view, I think, of kind of like the context of all of this narrative. But yeah, Ridley Scott is making a movie about two guys, and dramatically the most interesting thing is to be like, you know, what are their individual moral choices? And so I think that's largely what it comes down to here.
I think the movie focuses on that a lot, but I don't think it undermines the place within the individual within those larger systemic forces, and to what extent they can undermine personal virtue, as is shown. You know, Richie's kind of, you know, he's kind of depicted as quite incapable at the beginning of the movie, because he's just tossed around in this corrupt system, and nobody wants, you know, there's nothing in place to really let that virtue be facilitated. I think as far as, you know, the movie being about personal philosophy, I think it does comment on the issue of compartmentalization in an interesting way, that the way you can be super virtuous in one area of life and then somehow neglected in another. And I think that's a very basic truth about how we operate, that we're just filled with these internal inconsistencies and contradictions, and that it's important to examine those if we truly want to be that, you know, or want to present ourselves as a virtuous person. Then we shouldn't just do it in, you know, one area of life, but also make sure to cover the blind spots and to make sure you carry that out all the way, instead of just pretending you are this great human being in one aspect of life while neglecting it in another. Because that's, you know, there's kind of an inversion there with Frank also, who does essentially the same thing. You know, it's, you know, he's obviously worse than the cop, because he, you know, the parts that he focuses on, you know, his family, his place in Harlem, that's why he expresses his, you know, his version of virtue. But then with all the violence and the gangster life, he's obviously way more viceful than Richie is. But it's that contradiction that has been there since the very beginning. But I think, you know, since the very beginning of the gangster movies we've been discussing, the kind of facade in one area of life while hiding sort of the darker aspects that make that life possible.
We see that in The Godfather with the ending montage very clearly. We see that in Scarface with kind of his hypocrisy towards wanting to kind of protect his sister from the thing that he's engaging with. The hypocrisy, I feel like, is more implicit in Goodfellas because Henry Hill is so kind of blatantly just owns his love of wanting to be a gangster. But it's still there, you know, underneath the surface, for sure. But yeah, that's been a core theme.
It's. I think in Goodfellas, it's there in the idea that everyone's shaking hands, buying each other a bottle of wines,
Right.
and then the other moment they'll
Shoot each other.
be insulted
Yeah.
and shoot each other in the face. Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
But I like the way this American Gangster has an element of that, or carries that element to its cop character, but then brings it more down to earth in a way, or it makes it more relatable because, you know, the hypocrisy, I think, in all these gangsters, that's something that a lot of people recognize, but that's not something, at least to me, that's going to make me, maybe I should reflect on my own life and actions because, you know, it's just too far removed from my own reality, my non-gangster reality to really make that connection. But by flipping that around to Richie, you know, who's more of this everyday guy who's just doing well on the job but not doing well at home, you know, that's something I can more easier relate to, or, you know, or that I'm guessing most people in general can relate to, who have found themselves being very attentive to, let's say, their work or something else, and then maybe being a little bit more neglectful when it comes to stuff at home or whatever, or maybe the other way around. But so that I think is the interesting bit in this movie with regards to personal philosophy, personal morality, and the more individualistic nature of this story, or at least this aspect of the story. But yeah, as for the more systemic stuff, I'm thinking maybe we haven't really properly introduced Frank Lucas as a character really, and what his where his story sort of begins, because that I think is very much related to also his place within the society, and which is also what enabled his rise to power in a way. Because basically he is this black gangster from Harlem who started in the 50s or 60s or something. I don't remember the exact starting point of the story. Yeah. So he is being mentored at the beginning of the story by this other mob boss figure who's buying cocaine from the Italians, I think, and then he basically gets his stuff like second rate and then cuts it up, and then it's distributed in an even worse state to the people of Harlem, or at least that neighborhood. But then he dies, and then Frank sort of claims power, but he manages to go. That's also when the Vietnam War starts, and he learns of all these soldiers who get addicted to heroin and coke and whatnot while they're over there in Vietnam. And so Frank goes to Vietnam himself to buy his cocaine. Is it cocaine or heroin? I keep forgetting what heroin.
Yeah.
He buys it directly from the creators there, or the people who make the stuff. And so he comes back with like the cleanest stuff on the streets that's also cheaper than what the Italians are doing. I like, by the way, how the Sicilian family is mentioned every now and then, but it feels like, they are both about to be trampled on by this new kingpin on the street, but also it feels like more on that more meta level. It's kind of stepping over the Godfather in a little bit, not in the sense that it's saying, oh, this movie is going to be better, but it is kind of like it does feel like there's a little bit of a wink to cinematic history that, over there the Godfather is playing out, and here we're about to tell a new story. So it's because he's not related to any of these existing mob families that he's also capable of having his business and keep it extremely under the radar. That's also an important business tragedy that we've also seen in the other gangster movies, which they often fail to adhere to, is that they have to keep a low profile and not make a fuss, because that's when you get like pinged on the the law enforcement radar and maybe also by the other families. So yeah, that's and then there's an interesting turning point where he goes to like this boxing match and he gets this coat from his wife, which is this really flashy fur coat with like the big hat. And that's when he gets noticed, obviously.
Yeah.
That's when because, all the while this is playing out, the police have no idea who he even is. He's not even on their radar at all. They have this big blackboard or whatever it is, the stuff you see in the movies where they post all the photos on and draw all the little lines. But he's not even on there, at least not until that moment, until he dresses himself up way too nicely and then he gets noticed, and that's when people start getting interested. They start digging into him, Richie specifically, and that's when the whole that's the beginning of the end for him, basically. So yeah, that I think is the interesting contextual context there, I guess, for the Frank's rise to power, the fact that he wasn't coming from this established family that was already familiar by the law enforcement, and by the fact that he was exploiting the war in Vietnam. I think it was. I think they made it explicit, right, that he was transporting the drugs in the coffins of the dead soldiers.
Yeah,
which was a big point where the police force, they try to seize this plane, and he wants to look at the coffins, but then the Richie is sort of stopped because that would be like desecrating the sanctity of these soldiers, which of course Frank didn't care about because he did stow all the all the drugs in there, and so yeah, another nice little contrast there about integrity and where to use it and where to look away, and so yeah, and there's that the Vietnam War, and then there's, I think, his heritage as a black man, or his cultural background, which also wasn't one, I think, that was much on the police or wasn't much on the radar, I think, both with the other gangster families as well as on for the law enforcement when it came to being these serious players in the drug business, which he showed him for, because he ultimately ended up being, I think, the largest drug dealer in that era of history, at least in the United States. And lastly, I'd say for systemic issues is that there's obviously we've already talked about this, the corruption within the police that he knows how to deal with in his own way. He pays off the cops that hassling him a little bit. That's also, what's his name? Josh Brolin's character. They get into a little fit at some point. That's kind of the context that this movie plays out in.
I think the only thing I would add is that in the context of him being a black man, there's this kind of, and coming from that background, they touch on sort of his relationship to the police from the beginning, and that being like part of the sort of context for his movement into crime. They talk about that towards the end. And then there's also this interesting image of almost his rise as this kind of like perverse progress on the American dream, is how Richie's character puts it, where it's like, there's more equality even in our organized crime now, which is somehow, I don't know, like this strikes me as this kind of very American sort of uniquely American twisted like idea of progress. But yeah, nonetheless, that's definitely like a through line in this as well. I don't know if it's commenting on anything like particularly profound in regards to any of that subject matter, but it's present and it's there in a way that, racism and the relationship between the different ethnicities involved in organized crime have always kind of been a low-key part of these stories. You know, the Italians don't always get along with the Jewish mobsters, and you know, there's these different dynamics at play that we've seen play out in Goodfellas, Godfather, Scarface, some of the other movies. And then the same thing is kind of at play here, where he's not being looked at first very seriously because he's a black guy, and then that's shifting and changing over the course of this story. Yeah, I don't know that any of these movies are really dealing with like those things, at least from my perspective, from what I know, in a way that says anything that feels profound or new to me about them. Besides just acknowledging it as part of the dynamic at play in organized crime between these different sort of like ethnic and racial boundaries.
So far as it goes for this being a gangster movie, you know, as I was talking about Denzel Washington, or, you know, him being like specifically a black gangster, which on first glance should feel more subversive, but I feel like it is at some point, or in some way also very much a staple of the genre, that we get these outside or like immigrant or minority perspectives in these stories. I'm sure there's other people, you know, creators like FD Signifier or something who would have a lot more to say about the more black cultural significance here and what that means, as opposed to having, let's say, Italian immigrants or Cuban in Scarface. But that's not a subject that I'm particularly well versed in as a white European guy.
Some of our listeners might have insight beyond what we have just watching this movie. If you do, I'd be very interested to hear about it in our Discord or comments somewhere. It's interesting to note. I wish I had more perspective on sort of how this relates to the others, or what the depiction of like Harlem, you know, means in this movie, if it was significant at the time, if it you know, if it's accurate, or if it has its own sort of slant that's maybe twisting things in a certain way. It's hard. It's hard to tell.
I'm guessing it does make more explicit the relation between the civilians and the police, which between black people and the police force, at least in the United States, has always been a little bit more contentious than, let's say, the Italian Americans and the police. Yes, I think. Yeah. I'm not sure we're the right guys to really dive into that exactly. with much more insight than that.
The level of insight I have is essentially to say that I don't know that this movie is particularly insightful about it. I think it does, to my eye, it seems like it does a fine job of depicting things, but it like Ridley Scott is also not the guy who has, and Steve Zazalian are also not the guys who have a ton of insight on these things, you know, necessarily. So, you know, I think...
Yeah, it's definitely not a Steve McQueen or a Barry Jenkins movie that would most probably play a subject like this very differently, or depict something like this very differently. But, I do think I do think you're right that the movie doesn't set out to really explore these racial dynamics in more detail than the other gangster movies did, and maybe just I'm not sure if it saying that it would use it as just more of a flavoring, that's also maybe not doing it justice, but it does feel like this movie still first and foremost really wanted to be that kind of sweeping gangster story we already had with Goodfellas, and that we saw with Scarface and The Godfather, without being a straight up throwback. You know, there's one movie that I hadn't mentioned that also came out in this decade, and that's Road to Perdition, which I thought was fine, but it also that's one that felt more like, we're gonna make a movie like the way they used to make that movie, you know. Whereas I do feel like American Gangster tried to update it a little bit, at least for the new millennium, or at least for a new audience, even though the movie is still very retro in its presentation. And
but it's retro, I think, interestingly in a way that takes after more of class. We see a fusion of the gangster genre and like the classic police thriller or like the crime thriller, where like stylistically this movie looks a lot more like The French Connection or Serpico, or like some of these like 60s 70s kind of like gritty police detective dramas. That's kind of, in terms of look and feel, I feel like what it takes after. Structurally, it takes after the big gangster epics that we've been talking about. But then there's a lot of shots in this that, feel like Ridley Scott's doing his best, like, French Connection or something like that. Which is a fusion I think is cool, and I think it's one other people have explored as well.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I couldn't help but laugh a little bit at first at the bad wigs and the 70s makeup, which add a little bit of a not like a parody, but it does feel like at first it's not a fully self-serious movie, but then later on I do feel it is very much taking itself seriously. Maybe it was just me who had to get adjusted to the aesthetics of the 70s, which feel a little bit weird now, because it's now there's like this double layer of nostalgia where it's not the 70s as we look at it now, but it's the 70s as it was looked back on from 2007, I think, when this film came out, which already is, there's already a pretty big gap between here and that movie, and then from that movie to the time when it's actually taking place. But that also works, I think, to its advantage when because I do feel like this movie has a very classic feel to it. It's shot, I think, or pretty sure on actual film stock. Has some great location shots. It does mostly fine, I think, in terms of like the way people are dressed and the way they look. Sometimes I think, especially that the guy who plays the first partner of Richie is a little bit over the top in how 70s he looks, but some of the later ones do, by the way. But yeah, overall it very much feels like a movie that would now be made with digital cameras, green screens, or like somewhat obvious green screens, where you have just these full CGI shots of New York or whatever city they're taking place in the 70s, instead of having a real location that's just well preserved, or part of a location that's well preserved.
They were able to shoot on like abandoned buildings in Harlem that were from that era, and by, I don't know if they went back in and dressed them back up or just used them in the existing condition or whatever. But they do it. The sense of place, I feel like, is really strong without it ever feeling, sometimes you get these period pieces where it feels cramped because you can tell, like, oh, if you pan the camera over there, you're going to see like the wrong thing, or they had to like green screen everything beyond like this block very obviously because it's a CG city beyond that. I never got that feeling watching this movie. It feels very assured in its time and place, which I think is great.
Yeah, and the reason I'm saying this, it's not just because I think that's great filmmaking. It is, but I think that also is something that we've talked about earlier, which plays so strongly in the sort of gangster mythos, and part of what makes this fantasy or this story so interesting is that it is that strong sense of place, and that strong sense that these guys, the gangster side at least, they are part of this tangible neighborhood or this tangible community that is their little territory, that their little sort of Lion King kingdom, so to say, which they take care of, and which is where their lives play out, and which also is in this movie at least where the police also is a part of, and it's also their city, I guess. But that element that we've talked about, that with The Godfather and some of the other movies, that idea that the gangster movie is to some extent localized, or at least starts out in a local spot where this that I think is very much part of that nostalgic quality, I think, that is sort of almost accidentally maybe connected to the gangster genre, but that maybe is something, I feel like it's almost standing apart from that in terms of why we find these stories so interesting or so nostalgic even, because it plays into that feeling that all these stories take place in a time where that sort of physical space still mattered so much and was still so important, and it was just the stage where all this drama played out, which I feel like is a disconnect that a lot of people are now experiencing more. But yeah, that's I think also very much American Gangster. I think is therefore also an interesting. We touched upon it a little bit with Goodfellas, but I think this is truly like the last great gangster film in the sense that it feels like one of the old gangster films. It still feels like very much like that old sweeping epic. And I feel like everything that's coming afterwards, and we'll talk about this next week, feels more affected by the fact that we have grown disconnected from the kind of life that these gangsters indirectly portray, that kind of direct connection to an environment, that direct connection to a place. Because 2007, I think it was that this movie came out. It's kind of internet's on the rise. People are more online, and as we move into 2010s, that will become only more explicit. And I think that will also mark that interesting shift for our understanding of the gangster movie and our appreciation of it. But yeah, I guess we'll have to talk about that more in the next episode.
Yeah, and I think too, it's in a sense the story, the format that we're talking about here, the specific gangster, at least in the form that we've been looking at it primarily in these films, it doesn't really exist anymore in the same way. And so if you wanted to continue making these kinds of movies in the 2010s, in the 2020s, you'd just be doing throwbacks. And for such a thoroughly explored genre, I think, it would be hard to be making stuff that that wouldn't just feel like rehashing the same territory. And so I think we really start to see it kind of dissipate as a genre. Like, I think you're right that this is kind of the last attempts we'll see at really doing this same thing, at least that are working.
But even here, there was already a throwback. This is a 2007 movie that takes place decades before, and
right. And so, I think what we see is television kind of takes over some of that storytelling. True crime kind of comes in and starts to replace the gangster story. I think as the stories about seedy criminal underbellies that people are more interested in, at least in the cultural zeitgeist at this time. So I think what we'll talk about next week, The Irishman, I think really is more of a postscript to the gangster film. And most likely any films that'll come in the decades after this that kind of fall into this genre, if they continue, I think will also be sort of postscripts, or I think kind of like we see now with Westerns. In the future, we might start to see more sort of postmodern deconstructions of the genre where, like we talked about before, you might start to have now you have movies that it's a Western, but it's about the guy who just creepily plays banjo in the, and walks around and his son, you have these subversions of the genre in very poetic ways with the Western now. We might start to see that happen with the gangster film. I don't know if we will, but I imagine if it continues as a genre, that's what we'll start to see more of.
I think we've seen that happen because I think one of the defining gangster movies of the 2010s is actually, one that is defined by the fact that our, largely because of the internet, because of the financial crisis, because other larger societal developments and modernization, is that our perspective of what really constitutes the gangster or the gangster life and the kind of danger and the problem and the sort of corruption they represent, our understanding of all that has also shifted, and that I think led to another very classical gangster movie that is technically not a gangster movie at all. It's also directed by Scorsese, but I'll talk about that in the next episode.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Just to tease this final episode and kind of set the stage for it. I think some of the themes that we've been seeing, that we see laid out really explicitly at the beginning of American Gangster, where this scene where Bumpy, I think was his name, the previous gangster, kind of goes in and he's like, look at this store. The market is a supermarket now. We've seen it in films, in some of the films we've already talked about, but there's a sense that the gangster is kind of being displaced by something in America, like something is pushing them out. So I think we'll maybe talk a little bit about that next time. And then the other thing I think all these movies do is kind of stop a little short of sort of an ultimate examination of the morality of the gangster. We talked a little bit about the whole arc of the Godfather series and kind of how that follows Michael. So we get a little bit of that in The Godfather, but a lot of these films kind of end with this rise and then fall where the gangster ends up, in Scarface, he goes out in a blaze of glory. In Goodfellas, he just ends up as a regular guy. In American Gangster, he's back on the streets. He's no longer this big somebody, but he's free. I think eventually, yeah. I think the next movie we're going to talk about, The Irishman, kind of looks at, digs into that question a little bit further. Scorsese pushes beyond where most of these movies kind of cut off and digs a little deeper. So I'm looking forward to talking about that and wrapping up, at least for now. Maybe we'll have to come back in 2030 something and see where the gangster
the second half of this season.
See where the gangster film is at then. But
in the meantime, you'd be welcome to come hang out with us in our Discord server, the link for which you can find in the show notes or in the description, and see you next week in the final episode of our Gangster Cinema series.